going through a major crisis and need to put forward ways to transform our economy and put people, health and planet first. How we learn from each other internationally is a vital point in these discussions, as it is how we popularise alternatives to austerity, and that is why learning lessons from the Irish general election is such an important discussion to have. Arise is a celebration of our values of internationalism, solidarity and unity, and we're delighted to be part of it. Due to an amazing level of interest, as well as the Zoom webinar, we are also streaming live direct from the Arise YouTube page and across various Facebook pages. As the event goes on, please post your questions in the comment below the stream on Facebook and in the Q&A section on Zoom, and we will put some to our panel. So our speakers tonight are Mairéad Farrell TD, Sinn Féin member of our Irish Parliament, Ronan Burtenshaw, who is Tribune editor, and John McDonnell MP. So to get straight into our first speaker, Mairéad, would you like to kick it off, please?
Yes, of course. I just needed to unmute myself. First of all, I just want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here this evening. And I'm looking forward to hearing the discussion, and I suppose especially the Q&A, because it'll be interesting to see the different perspectives and also the different questions. And I suppose I was thinking about this earlier, you know, in preparation for tonight's meeting, and I have to say there was a monumental change in the last year. So just to give a bit of background, I would have run for election in May 2014 for the first time. So I was 24, and at that point, it was an extremely good election for Sinn Féin. It was a council election and European election. We elected 4 MEPs and we won 159 council seats, which was very significant at the time in Galway City. So I was on Galway City Council. We elected 3 city councillors from having had none before that, and that's 3 of 18. So quite a significant amount. So it was an absolutely excellent election for us, and you know, it really showed that people did want change at that point, and they saw that change in the European and local level. Then 5 years later, in May 2019, so just over a year ago, we actually had a very bad election. So we would have had 4 MEPs, that we lost 2 of our MEPs, and then obviously with Brexit we lost Martina Anderson, but in the north. So our level of councillors dropped to 81. So that was, we dropped on 78 councillors. That's pretty much half. It very much halved, and it kind of meant obviously that the party had to take a look at, like, you know, what happened, why did we see that shift away from Sinn Féin. And in fairness, I think the party really did take a look at things. It wasn't that our policies had changed or anything like that. It was just clearly in terms of messaging. I mean, there's a whole host of reasons. It's never just 1 or 2 issues. Greens had a good day, and that day they gained 37 seats, so they went from having 12 councillors to 49. The Labour Party increased by 6, and the Soc Dems, which was a new party, elected 19 councillors. So it was very much a centre-left gain in that election, while ourselves and then Solidarity and People Before Profit both lost out. So Solidarity / People Before Profit went from having 28 councillors to 11. So it was very much the shift left, I suppose, went kind of to more centre left thing. And we did, as a party, we very much like, you know, took a look at things. I had already been selected as a general election candidate at that point, and we just locally very much said, right, this is an opportunity for us. We just need to focus on the general election, whenever that may be. We knew that the government was, you know, would potentially fall, and that we would have a general election, or that a general election would be in sight. So obviously morale was down, but we kind of had to say to ourselves, look, we really need to take a look at how we can appeal to people. Like, you know, and one of our TDs, Padraig McLaughlin, said to me the last week, it's, you know, like, our politics is the politics that that benefits most people, you know, and really it's a question of explaining our policies correctly, so that people understand, you know, because the shift for that change will need to come, because so many people are struggling, and so many people in Ireland are struggling. So then I suppose that was May 2019, so a year ago, but it feels to me like absolutely years and years ago. But then it came, I suppose, January to 2020, and at that point we kind of knew, right, there is potentially a general election on the horizon, and we were very much in election mode. But there are a few things I think that were absolute turning points in the whole build up to the general election. And in some ways, it was surprising that Fine Gael, I suppose, then called an election at that point. So Fine Gael being the party in power, propped up by Fianna Fáil. And it's worth bearing in mind that since the creation of the state, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil have been in power. And of course, for a lot of people, that's, you know, in terms of their psychology, you know, they're used to those two parties being in power. And it is a big thing for people to move away and to change and to trust somebody else to do that, even if those parties have so clearly failed them. But one thing that really did have a turning point was in January 2020. And this, to be honest, was really surprising to me personally, but I'll explain it anyway. The Minister for Justice, Charlie Flanagan, announced in early January 2020 that there'd be a commemoration for the members of the Royal Irish Constabulary and a regiment that had a reputation of intense police brutality and attacks on civilians. So that was in the early 1920s. And I'm sure Ronan will agree with me on this, but the reaction to that was absolutely monumental, something that I would never expected, because I suppose to me, it's absolutely no surprise that a Minister for Justice of Fine Gael would want to commemorate that. That didn't surprise me in the least, but it did. It seemed to shock an awful lot of people at the start. And it was, I think what it was is that I suppose it's coming up to the centenary, and an awful lot of local townlands, not even just villages, an awful lot of local townlands would have their own story about these forces. So it did have a surprisingly monumental impact on people's perception of Fine Gael. And that came then, and an election was called. But then, of course, that was one thing that I personally surprised me, that it would have had such an impact. But then there were, of course, other, you know, social factors that had an impact. And one thing that really was something that I found on the doors in the general election, I suppose general and local elections are obviously very different. Local elections, it's about what can you do in terms of fixing the potholes, all that kind of thing. And in the local elections in May, it was very much a green agenda was out there, like, you know, and maybe it was a fault of the left to not be strong enough on green issues, to show that really in order to tackle green issues, you know, you need, you know, it needs to be left wing. Like, capitalism is never going to solve that. But one thing that really came out was the pension age. So the pension age in Ireland at the moment is 66. They raised it then, they said they were going to raise it to 67, and that would follow on then to raising it to 68. And Pierre Stardy, who is Sinn Féin's finance spokesperson, came out very strongly from the start that no, we're not in favour of that, and that our policy and in our manifesto was that we would change it back to 65. And I mean, that was raised at every single door that I knocked, because everyone had a story on that. Like, that really shook people to the core, because people, like one person said to me, you know, it's all well and good for politicians to make these decisions when, first of all, they can get their pension way earlier. And second of all, you know, they're sitting down while, like, I have to run up and down ladders, and I'm not going to be able to do that when I'm 67. There's absolutely no way that I can do that. So that was something that really shook people, I found. Then I suppose another thing that I felt was that people just had enough. So the mainstream media, the government very much said that Ireland was the poster boy for economic recovery, but obviously nobody actually felt that. So one thing, like, you know, we saw a lot of strikes in the public sector. I worked in the private sector at the time. You know, despite the company clearly doing well, you know, there was absolutely no talk of anyone getting a pay rise. There hadn't been pay rises in a very long time. And then there was kind of two key issues, and I'm sure it's the same where you are, but for us, there was very much two key issues, and that is housing and healthcare. So housing, it's excessive rents, it's no public housing being built, so massive social housing waiting lists, and people unable to get a mortgage. So it's those three strands. I mean, they really affected people. So people are either, you know, unable to pay their rents can go up, they can, you know, end up having to be kicked out. Huge issue of homelessness. You're on the social housing waiting list, and you could be on it for 10, 11 years, and you've no sign of getting a house. Because in Galway City, where I'm from, in a 10-year period, they didn't build a single social house, like public house. So that meant obviously that there was no chance of people being able to get a house, and there was no prospect of that. Then in terms of mortgage, I'm 30, people, friends of mine, working, trying to get a mortgage, absolutely no chance of it. When they're trying to rent at the same time, there's no possibility of being able to, with those excessive rents, being able to actually save for a mortgage. So, a lot of them had to move home, but for an awful lot of people, that just isn't a realistic prospect. People have different issues at home. And then it really became clear that it's very much for investment trusts and that. So like for real estate investment trusts, they were, buying up properties, were able to put high rents on them. And just one thing that I thought was very interesting, I'm just going to read a quote, but it was very much like, the rental profits were exempt from corporation tax, and one tax firm published a report, and it's in its briefing note, it said with regard kind of to Fine Gael housing policy that it has benefit both institutions and developers at the expense of individual buyers. So it's very clear that it wasn't for the people. So that housing became an issue that affected everyone, or every family it was affecting. And then healthcare was the other issue. So we had a situation where, we have a situation, I suppose it's kind of different with COVID because people weren't going into the hospitals, but we had a situation with COVID that, or with the hospitals, that people go into hospitals and they're on trolleys. There was a huge trolley crisis. People weren't able to get beds. So that was another massive issue, that people just, everyone had a story either on health and housing, and people realised, we were constantly told by Fine Gael that we are in recovery, but it was very, very clear that we are in absolutely no way in recovery. So I think then the left, because of, I suppose, the last election, had a far better, stronger messaging, and we ensured that our messaging was very clear to the public, and then we just saw that shift. So we had a very short general election campaign of 3-4 weeks. We just saw an absolute change in the way what people were saying at the doors, and it very much didn't give the right wing parties the chance to nearly even combat that, because people were so fed up and they just wanted that change. So I went from leaving my job, I took 1 week unpaid leave so that I'd have annual leave for the rest of the year, because I assumed I was going straight back into work after the election. And then I took a week holiday, telling everyone in work, don't worry about it, I'll be back anyway, because there's only 4 people on my team, and telling them all not to put money on me, which they're really annoyed with me about still. And then suddenly I got elected, and got elected well. So there was a monumental shift, and I do think it was, that people just were fed up. And now, of course, we're seeing that, unfortunately, it looks like the Green Party are going to prop up a Fianna Gael government, which annoys me to the core, because they benefited from the vote left, transfer left campaign that we had all kind of bought into. And it's a very sad reality in Ireland that we see these centre-left parties going in with Fianna Gael, not sticking to the promises that they made. And then people feel, well, first of all, people don't believe that real change, fundamental change will happen, because they've never seen it happen, and they don't believe that that fundamental change will happen. But it also means that they think that those small measures that these centre-left parties promise, that they won't happen either, because every time these centre-left parties go into coalition, they don't do what they promise. So I could talk for hours, but it's 12 minutes in, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Mairéad. Just so everyone knows, we've got 350 people watching from all over the country: Hull, Birmingham, London, Bradford, Wolverhampton, Kent, Wales, Sussex, Hull again, Leicester, Rotherham and High Peak. So now on to Ronan, if you'd like to go. You're on mute.
I've unmuted myself there. I'm 30 now, so I'm only getting used to these technologies. Yeah, thank you all for inviting me. Thanks to the Arise Festival for asking me to speak, and thanks to Mairéad as well for an excellent opening there. And congratulations to her as a new TD, and to Sinn Féin on their excellent performance in February. So I thought I would start by discussing a little bit about that background in the election, but also not only the immediate backdrop to February, which Mairéad covered very, very well, but a decade of enormous change in Irish politics, which has upturned a right-wing duopoly which had dominated the political scene since the arrival of independence in the southern part of Ireland. Obviously, we know the numbers in terms of the performance that Sinn Féin achieved. They ended up as the largest party by vote with about a quarter of the vote. But one of the things that probably isn't talked about as much in England, in Britain, about the election is the degree to which the two historic right-wing parties fell away. So as recently as 2007, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil combined were on almost 70% of the vote. And the most recent election, they dropped to about 43% of the vote between them. That is a historic change over the course of 13 years, and it has come because the political landscape as a whole has changed. The result that we saw in February was one which definitely pivoted to the left, but it was a change which was brought about by a changing vote pattern on class and generational lines. So when you look at it in terms of Sinn Féin's vote, we've got about 33% of the vote in the DE section of society. It got the same amount of vote as Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil combined among skilled workers, so the C2 section of society, and only 12% amongst the AB category. Again, when you look at the age divide, it's even more stark on the left-right basis. Sinn Féin got as much vote under 35 as Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael combined, but equally the Greens did tremendously well amongst younger voters. The Social Democrats did disproportionately well. The People for Profit Alliance, Solidarity, across the board, really, parties of the left of centre did tremendously well in the election with younger voters. Now, obviously, the Green vote tends more middle class. They got the higher proportion amongst AB voters. But even where that is the case, the issues that define the election and the electoral terrain were really clearly ones of the left. So on the exit poll after February's election, 32% of people said that they voted because of healthcare and 26% said that they voted because of housing. The dominant issues of the entire election were ones that were about improving the conditions of public services, improving the availability of housing at an affordable rate for working people in Ireland. And that is really, February's election is the election that Ireland was threatening to have for a very, very long time before it arrived. And what I mean by this long process of a shift, I think of it as like a tectonic plates of Irish politics having changed over the course of the last decade. When the Troika arrived in Ireland in 2010 with their deeply unpopular austerity programme, there was initially a kind of upsurge of resistance. The Irish Congress of Trade Unions organised mass rallies. The Labour Party, who were at that stage the kind of vehicle for opposition to the established right-wing parties, they rose in the polls to about 30% at one point. In the end, the Labour Party got 19.4% in 2011's general election, and then went in, as Mairéad kind of alluded to there, and made the historic error of all of the parties of the Irish left, from Clonda Public to way back when to Democratic Left, all of and Labour Party, in fairness, for almost all of their history, as propping up the right-wing parties. So instead of using the opportunity that they got, their highest ever vote in 2011, to make the case for a fundamental alternative government in Ireland, a government of the left, a government that would really break with the Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil stronghold, the Labour Party chose instead to prop up Fine Gael, and then propped up a really vicious austerity program which tore away the social fabric for huge parts of the country, really hammered working class people, really hammered young people, and produced a great amount of suffering in Ireland. And as a result, the Labour Party were almost destroyed, really, in the Irish political scene. They were driven down to historic low votes from historic high votes just a few years beforehand. And one of the things that happened during the course of all that was that the momentum for change flowed towards Sinn Féin. And Sinn Féin, who had been a smaller party than the Labour Party for very many decades, all of a sudden became the kind of big party of the left in Irish politics. And they began year by year to rise. But it wasn't a straightforward kind of development. You ended up with very important key moments. One of the most important ones was the right to water movement. So in 2014, after a long period where Ireland was described as the poster child of the PIGS countries, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, Spain, the European peripheral countries who had suffered from austerity, Ireland was seen as the poster child, the well-behaved one, the one that accepted austerity. But the right to water movement changed all that. You had the largest social movement in Irish, in the history of the independent state in the South. And it was an incredible thing to see and to be involved in, because you got this movement that developed at a really grassroots level, with people going out and resisting the installation of water meters in their local areas, organizing outside of the traditional political parties on their own terms, confronting the state. And then this grew into a mass movement that produced hundreds of thousands on the streets, but it did it through putting together a coalition of trade unions, civil society groups, political parties, a broad left, as Mairéad kind of spoke to there, which in the latest election, in the transfers, you can really see began to form an actual force in society, a kind of a sense of what the left was in Ireland. That wasn't just one party here or one issue there, but was a broad anti-establishment and progressive kind of coalition. And this anti-austerity context met another context, which was the emergence of a new generation in Irish politics. And the young generation that came through in the period after the crash really had to deal with an awful lot of the sharp end of the crisis. I was involved at that time in organising things through ICTU Youth and various youth campaigns. We were fighting against cuts to dole. We were fighting against the job bridge scheme, which was forcing young people into free internships and unpaid labour. We had a department of social welfare that was sending people advertisements for jobs in Australia and New Zealand, and 400,000 people emigrated from Ireland at that time, from the south of Ireland. This is like in the Republic, that was about a tenth of the population left over the course of the austerity years, an absolutely extraordinary exodus, and disproportionately they were young people. And they were also dealing with the situations regards housing, they were dealing with low wages and so on. But they were also involved in shifting of the political terrain in other ways, because it was the most socially liberal generation in Irish history. And people were angered by the revelations that were coming out year on year about the Magdalene laundries, the revelations about the X case, the Tuam babies. And you got a number of very important campaigns then. The first was the marriage equality campaign in 2015, which fought for and won the right, equal marriage rights for gay people in Ireland. And then you had this, you know, kind of more pointed and difficult campaign, the historic one in Ireland, which was the abortion rights campaign. Where the X case had actually not produced the change that people had hoped for in the early 90s or 2000s, and you then needed further tragedies to push the political environment in the direction of repealing the Eighth, and that was the tragic death of Savita Halappanavar, of Migrant Y, then in the period shortly afterwards, another case that people can look into the background to, and these produced very strong movements for choice in Ireland, which propelled forward the referendum victory in 2018, which in itself really announced, with the size of that victory, 66% of people, as big as the Eighth Amendment had been passed by, in fact, in 83, with the power of the church and the Irish right, you then got to see that there was this new emerging generation. So just to conclude on that, my understanding of the last period of time, of that 10-year change in Ireland, is seeing this emergence of a new republic. And it's not just around kind of the issues that I mentioned. There are broader questions about what it means now, what Irish politics should mean, what it should be about. People are no longer satisfied with the old status quo, whether that means the question of a unity referendum, whether that means the question of tackling direct provision, and particularly, obviously, the fights that Mairéad has mentioned that people are throwing themselves into over housing, over healthcare, fights that I want to mention in the trade union movement, things like the battle of the Debenhams workers in Ireland at the moment against the conditions that are being imposed on them as that company goes to the wall. And you now have this context that opens up the prospect of a fundamentally new country. If it is possible, you know, Connolly had this great line about the movement in Ireland, the need to call into action on our side the entire sum of the forces of discontent. That really is the challenge now for the Irish left. Obviously, we're faced with the difficult reality that the Green Party might go in to prop up a right-wing government again, but really they can only hold back the tide for so long. The truth is there is an emerging consensus around the need to have a new social model in the country. There's an emerging movement that can bring it into being. And as long as it can pursue courses of broad unity around issues that really change people's lives, I think it's a matter of time before we see the first properly left-wing government in Ireland.
Great, thank you so much, Ronan. Now on to our final speaker of the night, John McDonnell.
Wow, there's not much left for me to say. Mairéad and Ronan, it was just fantastic. I think setting of the scene and the encompassing such a real range of the recent history and the movements that have taken place. And it is, both Mairéad and Ronan have really, I think, brought to our attention effectively just what rapid change there has been. I know it's taken a decade or so, but it is remarkable. The atmosphere is different. And I come at it from an old bloke, I suppose, and just the attitude towards different aspects of society in Ireland now. I just take religion, which is incredibly contentious, and the role of the church linked to the state, just how that now has almost passed largely into history to a certain large extent. The way in which the way in which the women's movement has developed in Ireland over the years and asserted itself, it's just been staggering, really, because it came from such a really difficult base and a base that was hemmed in by a whole range of cultural factors. And just from a sort of Liverpool Irish tradition, if you like, you look back on what my family still call the home country, and you think, my God, what a change in comparison it is from when we'd go over there, visits in the summer and all the rest. And I think it has been radical change. And it's been phenomenal. And the frustrations that have built up over generations have burst out now. And actually, I agree, all the analysis about the new young generation coming through, seizing the initiative on all these different campaigns is true. But I have to say as well, actually, it has revived the old left as well. A lot of the old traditional organizations that really weren't getting very far, those people who entered into them, a lot of them now, an older generation that was involved in that sort of left politics have woken up as well to the new generation's lead. I also think it's enlivened the whole range of debates at every generation, every level, in every community, and in virtually every institution as well, which is quite remarkable. So I think the potential is enormous, but the reality is we're still faced with a right-wing government, and I cannot for the life of me understand what the Greens are thinking of by propping up the two traditional parties. If they think as they might gain some small incremental gains because the climate crisis is upon us, I think they're kidding themselves, and I think their reaction against will be incredible levels of disillusionment in the Green movement overall. So I just worry that if that is the case, I think that it's a desperate mistake. Let's put it that way. So the issue for me now, and I was going to just be a spectator to this, and then got dragged into saying a few words. The issue for me is to ask questions of you, really, because we need to look at what the future issues are. The future issues are, and we have integrated economies to a large extent. What are the issues as we come out of the pandemic? And the issues in the UK will be already the Tories flying kites around. Well, you've seen it this last few days, cuts in taxation, but then eventually austerity returning. And I can't see any other route for the Irish government in this formation but to return to some measures of austerity. So the issue there is how do you react against that, and how do you build against it? And it is linked because the integration of the economies to such a large extent, it is linked to the Brexit issue in this country as well, and what trade deals will be undertaken particularly with the US and elsewhere, between the UK and other trading partners like the US, and what the implications are also for the Irish economy, and what the reaction will be of the Irish government in this new bizarre rotating, well, the rotation of elites, isn't it, really, within the traditional parties, effectively. And again, on that discussion about what is the nature of the post-pandemic society that we want, the question for me is, how do we ensure that that isn't isolated country by country, but is actually quite, if not just international, certainly global as well. And I think there needs to be a real discussion between progressive movements in the UK and within Ireland itself about what sort of society do we want post-pandemic? Because we are both faced with the potential of two governments renewing austerity and try and get them back to what they would consider normal, but it's a normality that we wouldn't accept as it landed us into the economic plight that we were pre-pandemic, and both are so ill prepared to cope with the pandemic itself. And so the same features that we'll have to confront in this country politically, the same features that need to be confronted in Ireland, and there'll be consequences for us both. The other issue then, obviously, post-pandemic society is the climate change. You know, just as we're saying the pandemic respects no borders, well, the climate change crisis now is coming on us apace and rapidly, and there is no way this will be solved or even we'll be able to move forward in the UK without some form of common agreement across Europe, and in particular with our nearest partner as well in terms of Ireland. And again, it's the discussion about what sort of social movements are we building together on this, and whether or not we can achieve an agreement on certain step-by-step objectives and goals that we can take in terms of all our movements. The other issue for me is, it just goes back, and I just throw it into, Ronan's mentioned unity referenda, etc., etc. What came out of the Black Lives Matter campaign so far, and it's been raised with me continuously in my constituency as well by constituents, is the history of the UK as an imperial power and the history of the UK in terms of its economic role over not just generations, but hundreds of years as well. And one of the demands of the Black Lives Matter movement has been, how do we reshape, for example, our education curriculum to ensure that people are aware of the role that was played by British governments and the British state and the British economic powers. And to be frank, it is something that we will need and have to, and rightfully will address. But I have to say as well, if that is the case, we'll also need to also raise the issue about the teaching of the history of the British state in relation to Ireland as well. And that is equally contentious, even raising the issue. I should say my family are from Drogheda originally. And people will know, therefore, walking past Oliver Cromwell's statue every day to go into the House of Commons is a bit of a challenge as well. I'm not calling for Oliver Cromwell's statue to be torn down or anything like that. But it's interesting how few people in this country know the role of Cromwell in Ireland, and also know what happened in the massacre in Drogheda as well. But again, I just throw into the discussion too about, there comes a time, and this is it now, just following on from the Black Lives Matter debate, that maybe we do need to revisit the teaching of history, the role of the British state, the role of British economic power. And it isn't just in relation to slavery, it is in relation to Ireland as well, which actually did result in slavery too, because there are large numbers of Irish people that are enslaved and sent off to the Caribbean as well. I just throw that into part of the debate, because the most important thing now is that we build movements of solidarity across our countries and across to deal with the issues that we face. And part of that solidarity is understanding our historical relationships as well, so that we can come to terms with them. So my questions are really for both Ronan and Mairéad and others who are participating maybe in the questions on this, is given the fact now that we have, I suppose, governments of the right, let's put them those governments of the right in both Ireland and in the UK, what is our strategy going to be on those key issues, which is building the post-pandemic society, opposing austerity that will come from the right, recognizing the implications of Brexit and the trading relationships that a right-wing government in the UK will seek to establish, which could potentially undermine wages, have further privatization of our public services, as well as undermining some of the environmental standards that we have, and the implications that will have not just here, but also in Ireland itself. But then also, how do we build a movement in both our countries now that actually addresses the existential threat of climate change? I think that's the debate that we've got to have. What's great is that I agree, there is that movement that's been developing recent years within Ireland and is based upon the younger generation coming through. I think we've got the same in the UK. We've had a bit of a setback, obviously, because of the blow of the last general election, and it's disillusioned some people. But what's interesting, after a short period of mourning, what's been interesting is just how people have bounced back now and are willing to mobilize themselves in different campaigns and different initiatives. But that's why I think we need to ensure that, as I say, people understand that these have to be international relationships and international initiatives and the sort of movements that we have to build. Rachel, I'll be quiet at that point.
Thank you so much, John, and some really big questions posed to both Mairéad and Ronan. I'm just going to add to those questions, so anyone at any point wants to kind of come in and either address the questions I ask or the questions that John has posed, let me know. So I'll take it in rounds of two. So our first two questions, our first one is from Aisha on YouTube, and she asks, what can the left in Britain learn from comrades in Ireland about getting these socialist policies to be discussed in the mainstream here? And question number two from Ben on Facebook, how can Labour and the left in Britain put pressure on the government on issues relating to Ireland, including full implementation of the Good Friday Agreement? And the third question, because we're doing it in rounds of three, not rounds of two, is how can Labour ensure that the current British government upholds its responsibilities under the Good Friday Agreement and implements a border poll? So does anyone want to begin? Yeah, Mairéad.
Okay, there's an awful lot of questions, so I might have to ask you to repeat some of them. But just there's a few things there that John said that I thought kind of stood out for what we're going through at the moment. So this week is kind of a crucial week in terms of seeing what will happen in terms of government. So Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Green Party agreed a programme for government last Monday. That now has to go before their membership. So just to be clear, Fine Gael's membership is largely decided, like their vote will largely be decided by their parliamentary party. So it would seem that that should go through no problem. There is some discontent in Fianna Fáil because Fianna Fáil have plummeted in the polls. Despite that, according to the programme for government, their leader would be Taoiseach, so Prime Minister, come Saturday if it's agreed. And then there's a lot of discontent in the Green Party. How much there is difficult to know because obviously we can't tell in terms of membership, but they need 2/3 of their membership to agree this programme for government for them to be able to actually join the government. So we'll know that on Friday then the Green Party's votes will be counted. And myself and Ronan were just talking earlier, and it's nice they have, is it Mark Buffalo speaking to them? He's apparently the Hulk. I'm terrible with names of actors, but he's speaking to the Green Party members tonight, which I think is depressing in itself personally, because I mean, really, you should have deeper politics than that if you're deciding on government formation. But in relation to, there's a few points there that John made that I actually think really relates to this programme for government. So one thing that's very interesting about this programme for government is that they actually have tax breaks for those earning over 100,000 that will cost 123 million euro a year. So I think that's something that really needs to get out there. And there's other tax indexation that will cost them, I think it's 3 billion. So it's a huge amount a year. So it's a huge amount of money that obviously, you know, in their way of thinking, then they'll be looking at tax at spending cuts. So what they're saying at the moment is that they'll borrow for the first, in this programme for government, they'll borrow for the first 2 years and then they'll be going towards austerity or cuts, or whatever way they want to phrase it. It's very much in the mainstream media that this is all we can do. That is life, that's the way politics works, so to speak. So people, it's very important for us to give an alternative view. And through our finance spokesperson, Pierce Darty, I do think that we have very much gotten a reputation as understanding economics. Before that, of course, they wanted to say that we were all loony left and we don't understand figures and sums. So that's one thing. But another thing that's interesting about this programme for government is that it came out at the weekend through a Green Party TD who's against the programme for government, but who's also their finance spokesperson, that they are assuming that Brexit will be fine and that there'll be no issue. So that's the assumption in this programme for government, which of course, is a massive assumption to make if you're agreeing a programme for government. But that is the assumption in that programme for government. In terms of, then there was a question about the border poll and Irish unity. Look, I think it's up to, in my view, we need Irish unity. We absolutely need a border poll. Obviously, that is fundamentally part of the Good Friday Agreement. A good friend of mine passed away yesterday, Bobby, and for me, I've never been more reinvigorated as today to ensure that we get a border poll and hopefully that we get Irish unity as soon as possible. I strongly believe that we need, I strongly believe in self-determination. I do think that there's been a few aspects that have actually changed the mindset of ordinary people I can speak for Galway. So I live in Galway, the city on the west coast of Ireland. For my friends, Irish unity, border poll, it's just not, for my non-political friends, obviously, it's just not something that would ever really cross their minds, ever. They would never discuss this with me. It would just never come up. But in the last few years, because of Brexit, it's now actually become part of the discourse. And that's obviously something that we need to, keep promoting and to ensure that it is part of the discourse. Another reason that it became, again, part of the discourse was in relation to Boris Johnson's initial reaction to the coronavirus, and the fact that that obviously impacted the 6 counties, and the fact that we live on one island. It's one country in my view, it's one island, and very clearly having 2 strategies in terms of the coronavirus does not work, and it impacts the health of everyone on the island. So that was very interesting. It was the first time that I noticed that people, the ordinary, normal, non-political people were actually discussing those 2 things had a massive impact in terms of United Ireland and a border poll. In terms of knowing how to kind of popularize left-wing ideas in Britain. I mean, I think the reality is, I think Britain went through something very different, and that was because of Brexit. So I think that Jeremy Corbyn very much and very well articulated left-wing ideas. And I know that one of my friends who is a nurse in London, who would never have been political, she worked in the NHS and was so strongly in favour of the NHS, having worked in Ireland and then worked in London for years. I mean, the woman could have been, from being totally apolitical, could have been Jeremy Corbyn's biggest supporter, and was absolutely devastated at the results, was texting me all night, staying up all night. And I mean, this girl was never political. So I do think that, that you have the ability to appeal that, and it's very much about appealing and articulating what the working class is feeling and articulating their point of view and giving hope. And I think that's what it is. And I think it's very much that so many people have lost hope because they have been devastated time and time again. I think it's about giving hope. And there's a lot of other questions, but I'll leave it at that and let Ronan continue.
That's great. Thanks, Mairéad. Yeah, I was thinking about this. There's a few ways to respond to those questions that have come up. One is to talk about, as an Irish member of the British Labour Party, to talk about what that situation is, right? And one thing that I want to say, obviously, when John is on the call, but not only for John, for Jeremy Corbyn, for Diane, is that it's important for us to remember when things were more difficult, who was standing up for Irish people when my family were over here in the 70s and the 80s, and things were tremendously difficult for Irish people. And a lot of people inside the Labour Party were taking a cowardly line at best, if not an outright reactionary line against Irish people. They were happy to follow along with the right-wing press hounding us then, as they hound asylum seekers and migrants and people of colour today in Britain in a different circumstance. And I think it bears paying tribute to the Labour MPs and the people inside the party and the Labour movement who stood up for Irish people at those moments where things were difficult. But as much as we, talk about the difficulties of the peoples of these islands over various times, there's also tremendous and deep connections between the people of Britain, the people of Ireland, and have been for such a very, very long time. When I think over here, coming to Britain and learning the history over many years of great movements like the Chartists, in which people like Fergus O'Connor played such a big role. When I think about the fact that the red flag that we sing at Labour conference every year was written by Jim Connell, an Irishman who moved over and played a key role in the Labour movement, and equally the other way around, some of the greatest and most important figures in Irish progressive politics were people who were born or shaped in Britain, people like James Connolly, who was Jim Connolly in Scotland before he ever set foot in Ireland, when he was actually for the first time set foot in Ireland as a member of the British Army. James Larkin, the fantastic union leader who is still the most important figure in Irish Labour history, was born in Liverpool and has similar connections to John in that part of the world. And so I think it's really important to remember that when Jim Larkin was leading the 1913 lockout in Dublin, the greatest single moment of the Irish Labour history, when the working class of the biggest city rose up in almost unison against the organised business class behind William Martin Murphy. Jim Larkin came over here to do his Fiery Cross tour and got enormous and enthusiastic welcomes from working class people in the major cities of this country, who understood that the struggle of people, of the dockers, of the train drivers in Dublin was just as much relevant to the struggle of working class people in London and Manchester and Liverpool and Birmingham and the cities over here as it was to their own country. And they were enthusiastic supporters of that effort by Larkin to raise funds and support for the 13 lockout. But the leadership of the Labour movement was not. And that was what, in the end, helped to break the back of that effort to win the class struggle in Dublin in 1913 during that lockout. It was the fact that while working people on this island perfectly well understood the context, the leaders of the Labour movement were too worried about the potential for radical activity. They were too worried by Larkin's syndicalism, and they were too worried, frankly, by the context of the national movement and the idea that there might be some who were involved in some way in Republican politics or whatever that are involved in it. And that, to me, is the lesson that has to be learned. Actually, there is no conflict between working class people in Britain and Ireland. The vast majority of the people in these islands get on tremendously well. We share a great cultural history and a great closeness. What there is the question of the policies of the ruling class. The policies of the ruling class in this country, which never really represented the people. And when John talks about the fact that people were not educated about what happened in Ireland, they weren't informed about it on the news either. They didn't know. People over here, ordinary people going about their day-to-day lives, they were not informed of the reality of what was happening in the 6 counties during the Troubles. They were not informed of the reality of, in fact, they were spun all kinds of lies about things like Bloody Sunday, why it happened, these dangerous people who'd been involved and who were attacking troops. They were not told the reality that this was ordinary people fighting for equal rights to housing, equal rights to jobs, equal rights to a vote, who were gunned down in the streets. They were not told that history. They weren't told it at the time by the news and their politicians, and they weren't told it in schools. And so it is wrong to turn around and then say that it is the responsibility of working people, of ordinary people in this country. No, the responsibility in the first instance lies with the ruling class in Britain for what it did in Ireland and in so many other countries. But there is a responsibility on the Labour movement and on those of us in the Labour Party, those of us who are socialists, to insist now that the relationship between working people in these countries is maintained And it is done by respecting that history, the fact that there were deep injustices done, and the fact that there needs now to be the right of self-determination for Irish people. And that means respecting, as the Good Friday Agreement lays out, the course to a unity referendum, insisting that anyone who has the brief of being in charge of Irish issues in the Labour Party respects that, and it's clear that in the near future, there is a responsibility to lay out a roadmap for how such a unity referendum will happen, which has within it clearly defined terms and say, this is what we see as the basis on which a unity referendum should happen, because on those terms, the Good Friday Agreement is still far, far too unclear. And one of those bases must be Sinn Féin becoming the largest party by vote share in the southern part of Ireland, because that is a sea change which could not have happened if people were not thinking again about some of the questions involved in unity. So I think that's one of our most important obligations in the Labour Party and the Labour movement in Britain. And I think that another part of it is, I think we have to insist, while it is correct that the Labour Party has broad relationships internationally and in Ireland as well, and it's right that it has a relationship with the Irish Labour Party and so on, that it must be right and it must be legitimate, that the Labour Party also has a relationship with Sinn Féin. That it is unacceptable that the only relationship the party can have in the north of Ireland is with the SDLP, a party that is aligned to Fianna Fáil, a party that has reactionary and backwards positions on questions ranging from abortion to gay rights, and which is not in tune with the left wing of Irish politics, while at the same time, the largest party by vote share in the south of Ireland is a left wing party to which there is no proper relationship with the Labour Party here. That cannot be a situation that is legitimate. One final thing, because I know I've taken up a bit of time here, it relates to this question of the challenge that we face, both of us, in economic terms and in our growing movements in the two different countries. There's no question Jeremy Corbyn's movement inspired people in Ireland. So it shouldn't just be looked at in terms of like the inspiration that can be offered by February to over here. What was done by the movement to the left of the Labour Party in recent years, by all of those activists who were part of it, was inspiring to people in Ireland. And it was direct in many cases. For instance, Aon Hamill wrote in Tribune recently about how Ógra Sinn Féin was inspired by the youth manifesto put forward by Young Labour. There were direct points of comparison and of inspiration between the two of them. And I'm sure those who, Pierce Doherty, Owen O'Brien, all of those people who were so involved in February's campaign and Sinn Féin would say the same. But we also, as well as having the ability to inspire each other, we have problems that unite us and that we have to face legitimately. And I think it's a challenge to Sinn Féin, and it's a challenge to the Labour Party here, where we've got to find a way to articulate a left-wing politics that fundamentally breaks from the neoliberal model of the economy, which has dominated our countries for so long. And when it comes to Ireland, it's a question of, well, are Sinn Féin prepared to lead a government that not only aspires towards 32 counties, not only like some kind of stitching together exercise of two broken states in the Irish southern and northern states in the island of Ireland, but are they prepared to fight for the Workers' Republic, the Socialist Republic, the ideal that was written into the movement from the earliest days of people like Connolly and Larkin? Are we prepared to fight for that? And that means taking on the model, which in Ireland is a kind of tax haven model dominated by foreign direct investment, with finance, pharma and tech dominating the economy and leaving just such a small space for decent, well-paying jobs and for a proper, well-funded public services and state. And I think it's the same challenge here. I think it's the same challenge here. I think it's something, John fought very hard when he was the Shadow Chancellor to try to articulate a different model for the British economy that was not as reliant on the City of London, that actually had some kind of prospects for reindustrialization through a Green New Deal, for breaking the power of the city, the stranglehold that it has, which has produced such a kind of desperate environment, working environment for so many people, where you've got a tiny ring of decent jobs and then low pay, insecure work for millions and millions of workers, which is only a situation that's going to get worse. Those challenges apply both to Sinn Féin and to the Labour Party, because no left-wing government over the next 10 years of this, prolonged crisis that we're going to be in will survive and produce the changes that its people aspire towards unless they fundamentally take on the economic model that has produced so much disaster in the last 30, 40 years. And we didn't manage it in December here. We had an effort, but we have to keep that on the horizon, because the truth is, any attempt to win a left-wing government that doesn't have at least that ambition will produce very little in terms of change, social change for our people.
All right, thanks, Ronan. So we have one last question and we're coming to the end. So if I can ask, you can keep your answers to about 2 minutes and kind of sum up as well. So our final question is about the role of trade unions, social movements and local campaigns in working towards left election successes. So if you want to kind of address that and kind of sum up as well, so we can draw it all to a close. John, do you want to kick off?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, certainly. I was carried away by Mairéad and Ronan. I just thought it was a superb summary of where we're at and where we need to go. Let me just make this point. Anecdote first. Interesting on Ronan relates to the history. I'm still quite adamant, maybe it needs to come from people like me, I'm still quite adamant that we do need to address the narrative about the historical relationship between the UK, between Britain and Ireland. And maybe it's a separate campaign for curriculum change. I just give anecdote really on a couple of things. Ronan mentioned the work that some of us did over the years in terms of the issues confronting the Irish community in Ireland, and here as well. I can remember organising in the GLC a conference on the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and all of our speakers were lifted under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Things like that were going on continuously. I'm just involved in a Jacobin, the American magazine, are doing this reading of the E.P. Thompson's Making the English Working Class, and I'm involved in it. It's been wonderful. And I pulled down my book, and in there was a leaflet, which was a book marker. And it was from 1992, which was a commemoration by the graveside of Bronte O'Brien, the Irish Chartist leader, where we're having a commemoration of his life. Again, some had been completely written out of history, and we had to revive just an understanding, exactly as Ronan said, of the role that Irish people played in this country in so many struggles. And it demonstrated actually the level of solidarity that there was between a different working class, the working class in Ireland and here. So I just want to raise this issue really. On the way forward, we need to have a real conversation now about how do we mobilise as one movement overall, and therefore what frameworks do we need for that discussion. And it does get down to institutional frameworks to enable that sort of dialogue, and also to enable action in solidarity as well, because the struggles that will be faced in this coming period is about who claims the future post-pandemic, particularly in the light of the climate change threat that we have. And I just think there's a matter of urgency now that on the left within the Labour Party now, we have to have the discussion along with Sinn Fein and other comrades about what sort of institutional framework do we need to have that dialogue. And we've had intermittent informal discussions and dialogue and some work together on different campaigns with the Irish left and progressive movements over there, but nothing that's been consistent. And I think what we need now, desperately need, is a consistent relationship around working in solidarity. I just make this final point as well. The Labour Party boasts its internationalism. We're not very good at international work anywhere. We just don't. We have, as I say, ad hoc relationships and institutional structures that are archaic and ineffective. We just need to break through that. And in many ways, that enables us to work together, learn together, and I think shape the future together. That's the challenge for all of us.
Thank you so much, John. Ronan, do you want to go?
I agree with John. We need to have international bodies where we can have these discussions. It's a challenge for us. Anyone who's read the history of the internationals will know why all of this stuff is so difficult. But the reality is, if, say, for instance, a left-wing government gets elected in Britain, and next door in Ireland, you've got a tax haven, which is busily, taking all the companies, if there's any increase in tax over here, over to Ireland where they can pay next to no tax, and you then have this huge hole in the revenue for British government. Well, then you can see very easily how the potential to do progressive things here is undermined by what's happening in Ireland, and that is the nature. The modern economy is that it is that interconnected. Whereas in the past, maybe you would have had one commodity produced in one place, shipped somewhere else, and then sold. Now each and every piece of that commodity is being produced in different countries, combined together over international trade, and then packaged and sold and so on. And so that interrelation means we have no choice but to have international solidarity. And we need bodies, we need organizations that can do that. I think it begins with our movements having international meetings where some of which John did while he was Shadow Chancellor, bringing together various progressive and socialist movements in different countries to have that dialogue, and then seeing what kind of common points that we can put together. It is difficult. Building unity across different countries is difficult. It's one of the reasons why capital is so successful and Labour is so weak right now, is that capital has major multinational corporations which are brought together under the banner of an Amazon or a Google and work in all of these various different countries in unison behind their agenda, whereas Labour does not have that in any considerable fashion. And so we have to find ways to do it. There are already existing points of commonality. For instance, when I was in Ireland, I was a member of the NUJ, I was a member of Unite. Both of those unions work in both countries. So those are places to begin, but I think it needs to be more fundamental. I think that we need to aspire towards the creation of something over this decade that looks more like an international, that looks more like the major trade union forces and socialist political parties of the world coming together around at least a basic common program. Because unless we do that, we'll be picked off one by one, country by country.
Could I ask people to just explore, before Mary comes in, the launch this month of the Progressive International? Because it is in a tentative form the start of that dialogue to construction of a more, I think, all-encompassing, potentially all-encompassing left progressive force.
Yeah, I think that's really so important, because I think I was at John's International Social Forum last year. Speakers, I can't remember who it was, came up with this line of like, the international ruling class, they have class solidarity, they work together, they know how to do it very effectively. Now the working class and socialist movements need to do that as well if we have like any chance of having any kind of opposition to them. Last and not least, Mairéad, please, can you close for us?
Okay, no pressure there at all, especially after, I was glad you mentioned that there was 300 people watching after I'd spoken, so thanks for that. That was some good solidarity. I suppose there's a few things I just want to say. First of all, in relation to John's point in relation to history and the history being taught, we have a huge issue of that with that here as well. For example, I ended up studying history and economics, but I'd always wanted to study history. I couldn't do history for my leaving cert, so my A levels, because it just wasn't offered in school. And I mean, the North is not mentioned. I mean, 10 men died on hunger strike, and it is given one line in the leaving cert history book. So there's a huge issue here as well in relation to the teaching of history and the understanding of history. But of course, if you don't want fundamental change, if you do not want to see this change in terms of United Ireland and all that, if people don't understand what happened in the North, that is of course beneficial. Then I want to go on to Ronan's point regarding Jeremy Corbyn's campaign and the impact that had on all of us. And I know when Jeremy Corbyn was in the process of doing his campaign to become leader of the Labour Party, I was working for a 2-week period in London, and I actually travelled on my own to somewhere, I have no idea where it was called, in London. I was absolutely terrified because I wasn't used to being in a big city, so that I could go to one of the rallies. I stayed for about 10 minutes and got a picture with a poster that said something like, vote Jeremy Corbyn. And I left because I was worried, with getting home in the dark. So I'm under 5 foot, so I always get worried when I have to walk anywhere alone in the dark. But so it definitely did, you know, it had a huge impact on all of us. In relation to the trade union movement, the reality is that here the trade union movement is mainly linked to the Irish Labour Party, but that is changing. I suppose on the back of what the Irish Labour Party did when they were in government with Fine Gael, and the fact that they really did betray the working class and they betrayed the left. I think a huge thing that we do need to recognise as well in relation to building the left and having a left government is, you know, is the European, the fact that, you know, you need to have a neoliberal economy to be part of the European Union. So, I mean, I think that is obviously going to be a barrier for any left-wing government. And I think that's something that we as the left do need to speak about and openly have a debate on, because that is something that will most certainly hamper our efforts. But just on a final point in terms of, I just want to finish on a final point in terms of our current thing in this state in terms of government. The reality is that we could still have another election. And we're ready for that election. Sinn Féin are currently on 27%. Of course, things can change in a heartbeat in an election, but that's the reality. The other thing that could happen is that the programme for government is rejected by the Green Party, or possibly Fianna Fáil, but more likely the Green Party, and then that a different type of government may form. If that were to happen, we would most certainly be pushing for, it's not just ourselves, we do also have other smaller left parties who supported Mary Lou McDonnell in her nomination for Taoiseach on that very first day in the Dáil, and that would be kind of, I suppose, a left bloc then trying to form a government. So not all is not yet lost, is what I would say. And I definitely agree with Ronan's point. The reality is, it's simply, if this does go ahead, if this right-wing coalition does go ahead, well, it's only delaying the inevitable. I think that if we are the lead opposition, we will be a very strong and effective opposition, and we will make sure to promote the politics, you know, for the working class throughout our time in opposition. But most certainly, I think if this goes ahead, it's simply delaying change.
So thank you, everyone, and thank you all of our speakers for coming and talking to us about such an interesting and important topic. And thank you for everyone who came and watched and asked questions. We know we have important battles ahead, and also know just how important our campaign for people, health and the planet is to be put before private profit is, and how essential events like this are to build links and solidarity across borders. We must keep working together to insist that there is no return to business as usual when it comes to our economy and politics, and to not only argue that a better world is possible, but win that better world. Please note that the next Arise event is at 7 p.m. this Saturday, June 27th. Palestine, Labour must speak out to stop annexation. We'll have a live link like this one did with Palestinians in Palestine, plus Carmen Abulsi, a Palestinian writer and campaigner, Philippa Harvey, the NEU member of the TUC Women's Delegation to Palestine, and Artin Giles, who is Vice Chair of London Young Labour, and Hugh Lanning from Labour in Palestine. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and have a great evening.